Samantha had always been the responsible one in her family. She was the kind of person who always stepped up when something needed to be done. Her younger sister, Claire, on the other hand, was a free spirit. Claire was fun-loving, creative, and never too worried about the details. While they were both close, their personalities were as different as night and day. Samantha was the planner, and Claire was the spontaneous one. It was a dynamic that had worked for them for years, even if it sometimes caused a bit of tension. It was a typical Tuesday morning when Samantha's phone buzzed with a message from Claire. It was a voice note, and when Samantha hit play, she could hear her sister's voice, thick with a mix of irritation and exhaustion. "Hey, Sam. I know this is last minute, but I can't make it to my nanny job today. I'm feeling really sick, and I'm pretty sure I've caught something from the kids. I need you to cover for me just this once. I promise it'll be easy. And Ethan's a good kid. He's not much trouble at all. Let me know if you're up for it, okay?" Samantha paused, the message for a moment, thinking. She was in the middle of a busy workday with a list of tasks waiting to be completed, but when she heard her sister's tired voice, she knew she had to help. Claire was always there for her when she needed her, and this was the least Samantha could do in return. Besides, how hard could it be to look after a kid for a few hours? With a sigh, Samantha sent a quick text back. "No problem, I'll cover for you. Just make sure you rest up." Samantha had always been the type of person who liked things planned and organized. She preferred structure and knew that stepping into someone else's life, especially for a day, would require a bit of flexibility. She had never actually met the family Claire worked for, but she had heard a lot about them over the years. Claire often talked about her job, how she looked after Ethan, the little boy, and how she got along with the parents. From what she gathered, the family was nice enough, but Samantha never imagined she'd be walking into their lives today. That afternoon, Samantha quickly changed into a casual outfit, grabbed her bag, and left her apartment, hoping the drive would give her a bit of time to mentally prepare. She followed the directions Claire had sent her to a quiet, upscale neighborhood. As she drove, she couldn't help but wonder about the family she was about to meet. Would they like her? Would Ethan be as easy to handle as Claire had said? When she arrived, Samantha was a little taken aback by how luxurious the house was. The driveway was long and bordered by neatly trimmed hedges. There was a large garden with colorful flowers, and the house itself was modern and spacious, with huge windows that let in plenty of natural light. Samantha parked in front of the house and took a deep breath. This wasn't what she had expected at all. She had imagined a much more modest home. She rang the doorbell, and a few moments later the door opened to reveal a young boy with curly brown hair, wearing a brightly colored t-shirt and jeans. He smiled at her shyly and greeted her in a soft voice. "Hi, are you Samantha?" "I'm Ethan." Samantha smiled back and crouched down to his level. "Hi, Ethan. Your mom told me you'd be here today. I'm going to help you while she rests." Ethan nodded enthusiastically. "Okay, I was just playing with my toys. Do you want to play with me?" Samantha chuckled. "Sure, what are we playing?" Ethan's eyes lit up, and he pulled her by the hand toward the living room, where a collection of action figures and board games were scattered on the floor. Samantha couldn't help but notice how tidy the room was. Every toy in its place, every cushion arranged perfectly on the couch. It was clear that this was a home where order mattered, and they settled into the living room. Ethan began showing Samantha his favorite toys. He was friendly and chatty, telling her all about his collection of superheroes and the adventures they went on. Samantha could tell that Ethan was a bright child, full of imagination and curiosity. He wasn't shy at all and quickly warmed up to her, which made Samantha feel more at ease. As they played, Samantha couldn't help but glance around the house. Everything about it was pristine, every surface polished, every corner neat and organized. It wasn't just the living room that had a sense of order. Even the kitchen, which she had briefly passed through, was immaculate. The counters were clear of any clutter, and the appliances looked brand new. Samantha was beginning to realize that this wasn't just a normal home. It was a home that spoke of wealth and success. Ethan was still talking about his toys, but Samantha's mind wandered for a moment. She was curious about the family's background. Claire had never really gone into much detail about the parents except that they were nice and that they worked a lot. Samantha wondered what kind of work they did. It was clear from the surroundings that they were well off, but there was something about the house that made it seem like more than just financial success. It felt sophisticated, even a bit elite. The more she looked around, the more she realized how unfamiliar this world was to her. Samantha had grown up in a modest home, and while she wasn't struggling by any means, she was used to a more down-to-earth lifestyle. This kind of wealth, with its understated luxury, was new territory. But Ethan was so easy to talk to, so open and friendly, that Samantha quickly forgot her curiosity about the house. After a while, Ethan asked if they could do something else. "Can we play outside? I like to ride my bike, and it's really nice out today." Samantha agreed, and they went outside to the backyard. The sun was shining, and a light breeze made the trees sway gently. Ethan hopped onto his bike, and Samantha took a seat on the porch, watching him ride around the yard. As she sat there, she couldn't help but admire how peaceful everything felt. It was a different kind of calm, the kind that came with security and stability. Her thoughts were interrupted when the back door opened and a man stepped outside. He was tall, with dark hair and a well-tailored suit. Samantha froze for a moment, unsure if she should introduce herself or wait for him to speak. First, he smiled warmly at her. "Hi, you must be Samantha. I'm Lucas Warren. I'm Ethan's father." Samantha stood up quickly and extended her hand. "Nice to meet you. I'm here filling in for Claire today." Lucas shook her hand, his grip firm but friendly. There was something about him that was calm and composed. He didn't have the kind of aura that screamed wealth, but there was a certain confidence in his demeanor that made Samantha think he wasn't just a regular businessman. "I appreciate you stepping in for Claire. She's been working so hard lately, and I'm sure she could use the rest," Lucas said with a smile. "Ethan's had a good time with you?" Samantha nodded, trying to sound casual. "He's been great. We've been playing with his toys and riding his bike outside." "That's good to hear. I know he can be a bit much sometimes, but he's a good kid." Lucas's smile widened as he looked at his son. Ethan was laughing as he rode in circles around the yard. Samantha smiled back, feeling more comfortable now. "He's been wonderful. Honestly, I'm happy to help out." As they chatted briefly, Samantha noticed that Lucas didn't seem like a typical businessman. He had an air of quiet confidence, a sense that he was used to success without needing to flaunt it. He wasn't dressed in anything extravagant, but there was something about his calm nature that made her think he was more than just a regular guy. Little did she know, she had just met someone who would change the course of her life in ways she could never have imagined. Samantha spent the next few hours with Ethan, who was more than happy to show her every corner of his world. They had moved inside after a while, and the two of them played board games and chatted about his favorite cartoons. Samantha was surprised at how easy it was to talk to him. Ethan had an incredible imagination for a 7-year-old. He loved to create stories about superheroes, and each game they played turned into a new adventure. As the afternoon wore on, Samantha noticed that she hadn't seen much of Lucas. He had been around briefly when she first arrived, but after that, he seemed to disappear into the background, leaving her alone with Ethan. This wasn't unusual, though. Most parents who worked from home kept to themselves, busy with their own tasks, while the nanny or caregiver handled the children. However, something about the way Lucas had left the room earlier lingered in Samantha's mind. His calm demeanor had struck her as unusual. There was something about him that felt different from the typical businessman she had met over the years. He didn't seem like someone who was just dealing with daily tasks or meetings. His presence felt larger, more significant, like someone who was quietly in control of something much bigger than a regular office job. It wasn't that he flaunted it, but there was an aura about him that made Samantha curious. Samantha couldn't stop thinking about it. She glanced around the room, trying not to stare at the expensive decor. The house itself was stunning. Open spaces, sleek, modern furniture, large windows that gave the house a light, airy feeling. It wasn't overly flashy, but everything about the house screamed sophistication. The polished floors, the carefully arranged bookshelves, and even the artwork on the walls had a sense of understated luxury. Ethan didn't seem to notice Samantha's quiet observations. He was too busy, telling her about the latest superhero movie he had watched. He was so excited about the plot that he barely took a breath. Samantha smiled and nodded along, playing along with his enthusiasm. She liked how easy he was to talk to. He wasn't shy or reserved at all. He seemed to have an endless supply of energy and stories to share. At one point, Lucas appeared again, but this time he wasn't alone. Samantha looked up to see him walking into the living room, holding a phone in one hand. He was still in his business suit, and although he had obviously been working, there was something very controlled and composed about him. He wasn't rushing around or distracted by his phone, but his calm energy was noticeable. He simply took a seat across from Samantha and Ethan. "Sorry about earlier," Lucas said, his voice warm and friendly, but still carrying an air of authority. "I've been on the phone all afternoon with some business partners. It's been one of those days." Samantha smiled politely. "No problem at all. Ethan's been great company." Lucas smiled back, then turned his attention to Ethan. "How are you doing, buddy?" Ethan didn't hesitate to reply. "I'm good, Dad. I played with Samantha, and we're making a superhero team. We're gonna save the world." Lucas laughed, softly, a deep and genuine sound that made Samantha smile. He had a pleasant way of interacting with Ethan, full of affection and humor. But even as he engaged with his son, Samantha couldn't shake the feeling that Lucas was somehow different from the typical father she had encountered. He was calm, but there was a sharpness in his eyes that suggested there was much more to him than he was letting on. "I'm glad you two are getting along," Lucas said, as he stood up to check his phone again. Samantha noticed that he didn't seem as relaxed as he had been when they first spoke. His face had taken on a more serious expression, though he still maintained his composure. He walked toward the large windows that overlooked the backyard. Samantha could see him briefly glance out at the view, and she noticed how everything in the room seemed to be a reflection of his personal taste. The space was tastefully decorated. No bright colors or mismatched patterns, just a sense of tranquility and order. It made sense now. The house wasn't just the home of a regular family. It belonged to someone with a very specific taste for style and comfort. As she sat there quietly with Ethan, Samantha couldn't help but wonder who this man, Lucas Warren, really was. She had heard Claire mention his name a few times, but she hadn't gone into detail. It was clear that Claire's family worked in the business world, but that was as much as Samantha knew. Claire had never mentioned that Lucas was anything more than a businessman. Still, with all the luxury surrounding her, she began to suspect that there was more to the story. It was a little while later when Lucas came back into the room and addressed Samantha directly. "I don't want to keep you too long, but I wanted to ask if you might be able to stay a little longer today," he said. "I've got a few things I need to handle, and it would be a big help if you could stay with Ethan for an extra hour or so." Samantha hesitated. She had planned to leave soon and had things to do back home, but the way Lucas had asked made her feel as though it was more of a request than a favor. His tone was polite but confident, and she could tell that he didn't have to ask for favors. He simply made requests and expected them to be fulfilled. "I don't mind staying a little longer if you need me to," Samantha said. "I'm happy to help." Lucas gave her a grateful smile. "Thank you, Samantha. I really appreciate it. I know Ethan has had a lot of fun with you today, and I'm glad you've been able to spend some time with him." Samantha smiled back, though she was still curious about the mysterious aura that surrounded Lucas. There was something about him that seemed too composed, too professional to be just a regular dad. He had an air of someone who didn't need to prove anything to anyone, yet he had this quiet presence that made people listen. As the afternoon stretched into the evening, Samantha found herself thinking more about Lucas and his life. She couldn't stop wondering about the world he lived in. She had always assumed that business people like him were just like everyone else, working hard, raising their kids, and living fairly ordinary lives. But the more she saw of his home and his behavior, the more she realized that there was a side to him she hadn't yet uncovered. A side that made her wonder just how much she didn't know. As the day progressed, Samantha found herself falling into an easy rhythm with Ethan. The more time she spent with him, the more she realized just how much she enjoyed his company. Ethan was bright and funny, and he had a knack for making even the most ordinary moments feel special. Samantha hadn't expected to be so captivated by him, but there was something about his enthusiasm for life that made the day pass quickly. Still, her thoughts kept drifting back to Lucas. Every time she saw him, she felt this subtle tension, an awareness that there was more to him than met the eye. He seemed so effortless in his calmness, so composed, yet there was a sharpness to him that made it clear he was someone who didn't just float through life. It was something Samantha couldn't quite put her finger on, but it made her wonder about the kind of life he led outside of being a father. Samantha had always assumed that wealthy people lived in the spotlight, that they had flashy lifestyles that everyone knew about. She had grown up in a comfortable middle-class family, and though they weren't poor by any means, they had never experienced the kind of luxury that seemed to surround Lucas. She hadn't expected to walk into a mansion that felt more like a quiet sanctuary than a show-off palace. It was subtle yet stunning, a design that didn't need to scream opulence to be recognized as something special. As the afternoon wore on, Lucas didn't appear as much. He remained mostly in his office, away from the family activities, but there were a few moments when Samantha caught a glimpse of him walking through the house. He was always busy, phone in one hand, laptop in the other. The more she saw of him, the more she realized that he wasn't someone who took breaks. He moved with purpose, always looking like he had somewhere to be or something to do. Yet at the same time, there was this quiet energy about him. He wasn't rushing. He didn't seem frazzled. Everything about him suggested control. Curiosity gnawed at Samantha as she tried to piece together who Lucas really was. She began to notice things that she hadn't before, subtle details that suggested he was someone important, someone whose work wasn't just about a 9-to-5 schedule. One of those moments came when Lucas walked past her again while she and Ethan were sitting on the couch watching a movie. He looked over his shoulder as if noticing her for the first time in a while. "I'm sorry I haven't had much time to talk today, Samantha," he said, his voice warm, but still carrying a note of authority. "I've been in meetings since this morning. It's been a long day. I didn't mean to leave you to handle everything by yourself." Samantha looked up, a little surprised by his apology. "Oh, no, it's fine," she said quickly. "Ethan's been great company. We've been having fun." Lucas nodded, his gaze softening as he looked at his son, who was sprawled across the couch engrossed in the movie. "Good," he said. "I'm glad. Ethan can be a lot of work sometimes, but he's a good kid. He needs stability." Samantha smiled, not sure how to respond. There was something about Lucas's tone that suggested he wasn't just talking about parenting. It sounded like he was talking about something bigger, something more important than just raising a child. A few moments passed in silence, and then Lucas spoke again. "I hope you're not feeling uncomfortable here. I know it's a bit of a strange setup, but I appreciate you filling in for Claire today." Samantha shook her head. "No, I'm fine. Honestly, it's been a nice break from my usual routine. The house is beautiful, and Ethan is a joy to be around." Lucas gave her a small smile, but there was something about the way he smiled that made Samantha feel like she was missing a piece of the puzzle. He wasn't like the other parents she had worked for. He was different, more reserved, more intense, but still polite. He didn't speak much about his personal life, and it was as if he was intentionally keeping it private. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that she knew almost nothing about Lucas's life beyond his role as Ethan's father. As the evening wore on, Samantha felt a growing sense of curiosity. She wanted to know more about Lucas. She had worked for enough families to know that there was always something more beneath the surface. The way he carried himself, the way the house was arranged, the quiet confidence he exuded. It all pointed to something far bigger than just a successful man managing his business. There was a quiet mystery about him, and that made her want to dig deeper. Just as Samantha was lost in thought, Lucas walked back into the living room. This time, he had a cup of coffee in hand, and he seemed a little more relaxed. He sat down, on the armchair across from her and Ethan, looking at them for a moment before speaking. "I don't mean to keep asking this, but are you sure you don't mind staying a little longer tonight?" he asked again. His voice was still calm, but there was an undercurrent of something else, something that suggested he wasn't just making small talk. He seemed to want to make sure she was comfortable. Samantha looked at him, trying to gauge his tone. "Honestly, I don't mind," she said. "I'm happy to help." Lucas nodded, his gaze softening. "I appreciate it, really. It's not often I get to spend time with Ethan without a lot of distractions." Samantha's curiosity was piqued even more. There was something in his words that made her wonder what kind of life Lucas had outside the house. He seemed so focused on his work and his son, but there was an unspoken tension around him, like he was carrying a heavy load, something that didn't have to do with just the day-to-day tasks of running a family. "Is there something you need help with?" Samantha asked, breaking the silence. She hadn't meant to be forward, but she was genuinely curious. She couldn't help herself. Lucas glanced at her for a long moment before replying, his voice quiet. "It's just that sometimes it's hard to balance everything. Work, family, time. There's not much room for mistakes." Samantha blinked, a little caught off guard by his words. He wasn't talking about something ordinary, something that most people struggled with. There was a weight in his words that suggested he was speaking about more than just the usual problems of balancing work and family life. "I'm sure you're doing your best," Samantha said gently, not knowing what else to say. "It's not easy, but it's clear you care about Ethan." Lucas nodded, his eyes showing a flicker of something deeper. Perhaps gratitude, perhaps something else. He didn't say anything more, but the conversation had shifted in a way that left Samantha feeling like she was standing on the edge of something she couldn't yet understand. For the rest of the evening, Samantha stayed with Ethan, and the night passed by more quickly than she expected. As she got ready to leave, she couldn't stop thinking about Lucas's words and the quiet intensity behind his calm demeanor. She didn't know it yet, but she had only scratched the surface of the world he lived in. As the evening drew to a close, Samantha began to gather her things to leave. Ethan had already fallen asleep on the couch, exhausted from all the fun they'd had during the day. His gentle breathing filled the quiet room as Samantha slowly tiptoed around him, careful not to wake him. She felt a sense of accomplishment. The day had gone better than she had expected. Ethan was a sweet, energetic kid, and she had managed to help him with his homework, play games, and even enjoy some quiet moments together. But as she stood by, the door ready to head home, her thoughts turned once again to Lucas. The more time she spent in his home, the more questions seemed to arise. She had begun to notice things about him, the way he carried himself, the subtle tension in his voice when he spoke about work, and the sense that there was something more beneath the surface. It wasn't just his calm, composed exterior that intrigued her. It was the sense of mystery that surrounded him. He wasn't like other men she had met, and she couldn't quite figure out why. There was an aura about him, something that suggested his life was far more complex than just raising a child and running a business. Just as she was about to slip out the door, Lucas appeared again. This time he wasn't rushing around or buried in his work. He stood in the hallway watching her with a slightly distant expression. He had changed into a more relaxed outfit, a simple t-shirt and jeans, and his posture was less formal than when she had first met him. It was as if, for the first time that day, he was really taking a moment to breathe. "Leaving already?" Lucas asked, his voice softer than before. "I thought you might stay a little longer." Samantha hesitated. She hadn't expected him to want to keep her there longer, especially after the earlier conversation. She had already helped him out for the day, and she was ready to go back to her own routine. But there was something in his eyes that made her stop. He wasn't pressuring her, but the sincerity in his voice made her feel like he needed her there, even if just for a few more minutes. "I didn't want to overstay my welcome," she said with a smile. "I've had a great time with Ethan. He's a wonderful kid." Lucas nodded, his expression thoughtful. He walked over to the living room and sat down on one of the armchairs, motioning for her to join him. "I appreciate you stepping in for Claire today," he said, his tone still calm but with a hint of gratitude that made her feel valued. It's not always easy to find someone who can connect with Ethan the way you did. He's a good kid, but he's a little different. Samantha furrowed her brow in confusion. Different how? Lucas leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair as if trying to figure out how to explain. He's not the easiest child to raise. He's smart, but sometimes he's a bit of a loner. He's always in his own world, and sometimes I feel like I'm not doing enough for him. Samantha was taken aback by his words. She had never seen any signs of Ethan being difficult or distant. In fact, he had seemed so open and friendly with her. But as Lucas spoke, she began to understand that raising a child wasn't always as simple as it seemed from the outside. There were layers to Ethan's personality that even his father had trouble navigating. I didn't get that sense from him at all, Samantha said, trying to reassure Lucas. Ethan is a great kid. He's full of energy and imagination. You're doing a good job. Lucas gave her a small smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. There was still a weight on his shoulders, something he hadn't quite shared. Samantha could tell that his life was complicated, more so than what she had originally assumed. The silence between them stretched for a few moments, and just as Samantha was about to stand up and leave, Lucas spoke again, his voice quieter this time. I should probably be upfront with you about something. Samantha turned back to look at him. Her curiosity piqued. What do you mean? Lucas hesitated for a moment, his gaze falling to the floor before meeting hers again. I haven't been entirely honest with you about who I am, he said, his voice almost apologetic. I've been very careful about keeping my life private, especially from people I don't know well, but I think it's time you knew the truth. Samantha's heart skipped a beat. What was he talking about? Had she missed something earlier in the day? Was there something about him that she had misunderstood? Lucas leaned forward, placing his elbows on his knees. I'm not just a regular businessman, he began. I'm involved in a lot of different things. Investments, real estate, startups, the kind of work that involves a lot of travel and time away from home. But the truth is, I've built my life around Ethan. I've worked hard to make sure he has everything he needs. But I'm not just a dad. I'm also someone who has responsibilities, big responsibilities that go beyond this house. Samantha sat quietly, trying to process what Lucas was saying. She had known that there was something about him that didn't quite match her expectations, but she hadn't imagined that he was involved in something so much bigger than the ordinary business world. What kind of responsibilities was he talking about? Lucas continued, his voice steady but carrying a weight that was hard to ignore. I know this might be a lot to take in. I don't usually talk about my work, especially to people I don't know. But you've been so kind to Ethan, and I feel like I owe you some honesty. Samantha nodded slowly, trying to make sense of it all. I understand, but I'm still a little confused. What exactly do you do? Lucas sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. I manage a number of businesses. Most of them are in high-stakes investments. I've worked with a lot of people in the financial world, and I've built a network of businesses that support each other. But the truth is, I spend most of my time managing my personal investments. The work isn't easy. It requires constant attention, and sometimes it pulls me away from the things I really want to focus on. Like being with Ethan. Samantha was starting to understand now. Lucas wasn't just a businessman who had a few successful companies under his belt. He was someone who was deeply embedded in the world of high finance, someone whose life revolved around big deals, risky investments, and constant movement. No wonder he had seemed so distant at times. The pressure must have been overwhelming, and it was clear that Lucas felt the weight of his responsibilities, not just for his businesses, but for Ethan as well. That sounds intense, Samantha said softly. Lucas chuckled, a little self-deprecatingly. It is, but it's the life I chose, and I'm doing my best to balance it all. It's just hard sometimes. Samantha sat there, processing everything he had said. She had walked into this day thinking she was simply helping out as a nanny for a friend's sister. But now, she was starting to understand that Lucas's life wasn't anything like she had imagined. There was so much more going on beneath the surface, and it was becoming clear that the world he lived in was far more complex than she had ever thought. As she stood up to leave, Lucas gave her a grateful look. "Thank you again for being here today, Samantha. I don't know what I would have done without you. Ethan really enjoyed spending time with you." Samantha smiled, though her mind was still racing with the new information she had just learned. "It was my pleasure. I'm glad I could help." She turned to leave, but before she stepped out the door, Lucas called out to her. "I'd like to talk more sometime if you're open to it. There's a lot more to this life than you might think." Samantha nodded, intrigued by his offer. "I'd like that too." With one last look at Lucas, she stepped outside, her mind full of questions about the man in the world he had just begun to reveal. As Samantha drove home that evening, she couldn't stop thinking about everything that had happened during the day. It had been such an ordinary start, just stepping in for her sister as a nanny for a few hours. But by the end of the day, everything felt different. Lucas had shared more about his life than she had expected, and the weight of his words lingered in her mind. She had come into the day thinking she was helping out a regular family, but now she knew that Lucas wasn't just any businessman. He was someone deeply entrenched in a world of high-level finance, a world she knew little about, but one that had piqued her curiosity. As she drove, she replayed her conversations with him. The way he spoke about his work, about balancing his responsibilities as a father with his business obligations, it all seemed so intense. She had known, of course, that people in business had busy lives, but there was something about Lucas that felt different. His calm demeanor and sharp focus made it clear that he wasn't just managing companies. He was making decisions that affected not just his future, but the future of many others. It was clear that he had a world of obligations. But what struck her the most was how much he seemed to care about Ethan. His words about wanting to be more present for his son had stayed with her. It was rare to meet someone who was both successful and so grounded in their desire to do right by their family. When Samantha got home, she sat down with a cup of tea, still reflecting on the day. She hadn't expected the experience to affect her so much. But as she sipped her tea, she found herself smiling at the thought of Ethan. He was such a sweet, imaginative boy. His stories and excitement about superheroes had been contagious. It was clear to her that Lucas was doing his best to raise him in the midst of his demanding career, and Samantha couldn't help but feel a little admiration for the man who seemed to manage both worlds with such quiet determination. The next few days passed in a blur. Samantha went back to her normal routine, but she found herself thinking about the Warren family more than she expected. Ethan had sent her a thank you note, a colorful card with a drawing of them as superheroes saving the world. She smiled as she read it, feeling a warmth in her chest. It was rare that a child would show such appreciation for something as simple as a day spent together, but Ethan had genuinely enjoyed their time. And Samantha had enjoyed it too. One afternoon, a few days after her first day at the Warren house, Samantha received a call from Lucas. She hadn't expected to hear from him again so soon, but she picked up, curious to see why he was calling. "Hello, Samantha." Lucas's voice came through the phone, calm and clear. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." Samantha smiled to herself. "No, not at all. How's everything going?" "Busy, as usual," Lucas replied with a soft chuckle. "I wanted to thank you again for filling in for Claire. Ethan really enjoyed his time with you, and I can tell he's been talking about you nonstop since you left. I'd like to ask if you'd be willing to help us out again sometime soon. Maybe next week? I know it's a bit sudden, but I could really use someone who Ethan gets along with well. It would be for a longer stretch of time this time if you're available." Samantha was taken aback by the offer. She hadn't expected Lucas to call so soon, let alone ask her to come back to help again. "Of course. I'd be happy to help. I really enjoyed spending time with Ethan." "I'm glad to hear that," Lucas said. "I'm not sure if I mentioned it before, but my schedule is unpredictable, and it's hard to find someone who Ethan connects with. I really do appreciate you stepping in when Claire couldn't. You've made a difference for him." Samantha's heart warmed at his words. "I'm happy to help. Ethan is a great kid, and I'd love to spend more time with him." They agreed on the details, and Samantha felt a mixture of excitement and curiosity as they wrapped up their conversation. She was looking forward to seeing Ethan again, but there was a part of her that felt the pull to learn more about Lucas's world. It was hard to ignore the way he had shared glimpses of his life with her, almost as though he wanted her to understand. She wasn't sure what it meant, but it felt like the beginning of something unexpected. The next week, Samantha returned to the Warren house. This time it felt different. She was no longer just the temporary stand-in for her sister. She was becoming a familiar presence in their lives. Ethan greeted her with the same enthusiasm, his eyes lighting up as soon as he saw her. "You're back," he exclaimed, running over to give her a big hug. Samantha laughed and hugged him back, feeling like she was becoming a part of the family, in a way she hadn't anticipated. Lucas greeted her as well, though his demeanor was more professional this time. He had a lot on his mind, she could tell, but he took a moment to thank her again for coming back. "I really appreciate this, Samantha," he said, his voice sincere. "Ethan's been asking about you every day since you left. I'm glad he has someone he enjoys spending time with." Samantha smiled, touched by his words. "It's my pleasure. Honestly, it's been nice getting to know Ethan better. He's a great kid." As the days went on, Samantha settled into the role of spending more time with Ethan. They played games, read stories, and spent hours in the garden. Samantha was amazed at how quickly she grew attached to him. He had such a vivid imagination, and a sense of wonder that was impossible not to be drawn to. But even as she focused on her time with Ethan, she couldn't ignore the subtle tension that lingered in the air whenever Lucas was around. She often found herself stealing glances at him as he worked, noticing the way his mind seemed always on the go. There was no escaping the fact that he was deeply invested in his work, and it was clear that his business world was just as complex and demanding as he had described. She couldn't help but wonder what it was like to live in his shoes, to have that kind of responsibility, that kind of success. Over time, she began to see more of Lucas. He wasn't just a businessman who left for work every day. He was a man who had built his life around creating a future for his son, even if it meant sacrificing pieces of his own time and happiness. Samantha began to realize that the world Lucas inhabited wasn't just about wealth or power. It was about constant juggling, balancing, and making difficult decisions. There was no room for error, and sometimes there was no space for personal desires. One evening, after a long day, Lucas pulled Samantha aside in the kitchen as she was preparing to leave. "I know this might sound strange," he began, "but I wanted to say thank you for being here, for Ethan, for me. You've made a bigger impact than you probably realize." Samantha looked up, her heart skipping a beat. She had never expected any of this to turn into something more than just helping out. But as she stood there, looking into Lucas's eyes, she realized that what started as a small favor had begun to transform into something significant. There was a connection forming, not just between her and Ethan, but between her and Lucas as well. "I'm just happy to help," Samantha replied softly, her voice steady. "It's been a pleasure." Lucas nodded, giving her a small smile. "I'm glad you're here, I really am." As Samantha left the house that evening, she felt a sense of anticipation growing inside her. She didn't know what the future held, but she was beginning to understand that her life had taken a turn she hadn't expected, and she couldn't help but wonder where this new connection would lead.